Welcome to Lantern and Lullaby. Settle into a comfortable position and allow the sound of rain and the gentle movement of the sea to soften everything beyond this moment. Tonight, your journey begins beneath the evening lights of a rainy harbour where an overnight ferry is waiting to carry you north across the dark water towards Norway. You'll settle into your quiet cabin, watch the harbour lights disappear beyond the rain-covered window, and let the ferry carry you through the sleeping hours until the Norwegian coast begins to emerge beneath the soft grey morning. So, get comfortable, let the day drift away, and when you're ready, step aboard for tonight's dream journey on the overnight ferry to Norway. The journey begins beneath a low evening sky, with rain moving steadily across the windows as the road carries you toward the coast. Streetlights stretch into soft reflections across the wet surface ahead, each one briefly lengthening before slipping beneath you. The traffic has already begun to thin, and the buildings seem lower and more widely spaced than they did earlier in the evening. Now and then, the road rises just enough for distant industrial lights to appear beyond the rooftops. They are too far away to make out clearly, but there is something about their height and spacing that suggests the harbour is getting closer. Inside the car, everything feels warm and enclosed, while the weather continues beyond the glass. The rhythm of the wipers and the muted sound of tyres on wet tarmac settle into an easy pattern. There is no need to hurry now. The ferry will be waiting at the end of the road. The road bends gently, and the first unmistakable harbour lights appear in the distance. They stand higher than the ordinary streetlights, scattered across the dark horizon in rows of white and amber. Beyond them, the shapes of cranes and loading structures rise against the clouded sky. The rain softens the edges of everything, turning the industrial shoreline into a quiet arrangement of silhouettes and reflections. To one side, you catch the first glimpse of black water between warehouses and fencing. It is only visible for a few seconds before the road drops again, but the sight of it changes the feeling of the journey. You are no longer simply driving through the evening. You are approaching the place where the land will end for the night. The ferry terminal lies somewhere among those distant lights. A gap opens between two terminal buildings, and for the first time, the ferry itself comes into view. It sits across the harbour under banks of bright white lights, much larger than it seemed in your imagination. Rows of illuminated windows run along its side, while the upper decks rise into the rainy darkness above. The hull is mostly shadow from this distance, but its size is clear from the smaller vehicles and dock structures gathered around it. For a moment, the ship seems completely still, waiting in the wet evening, as if the journey has already begun without moving. The road continues past another building, and the view disappears again. But now you know exactly where you are heading. Somewhere inside that vessel is the cabin where you will spend the night, and by morning, the same windows will be looking out onto Norway. The final approach road leads beneath brighter lamps and painted lane markings shining with rain. Terminal buildings stand close on either side now, their glass fronts reflecting passing headlights and the pale glow of the harbour. The car slows beneath a broad covered area beside the entrance. Outside, rainwater runs from the edge of the canopy in thin, continuous streams. The sea is hidden again from here, but the deeper sounds of the port are easier to notice. A low mechanical hum seems to carry through the wet air, mixed with the distant movement of vehicles somewhere beyond the terminal. The journey by road has reached its end. Ahead is the sheltered entrance, and beyond it, the ship. For the first time this evening, you step fully into the feeling of departure. The automatic doors open onto a warm, brightly lit terminal hall. The sudden quiet indoors makes the rain seem more distant, even though you can still see it moving across the glass behind you. The floor is clean and slightly reflective from the damp evening outside. Rows of seats face the windows, while simple overhead lighting gives the space a calm, practical feel. Nothing here is grand or theatrical. It is simply a place between one part of the journey and the next. You move further inside, away from the entrance and the sound of the road. Through another wall of glass ahead, harbour lights begin to appear again. The ferry is somewhere just beyond them. From the terminal windows, the ferry is now close enough to fill much of the view. Its side rises above the quay, lined with softly glowing windows and occasional brighter work lights near the boarding level. Rain beads across the terminal glass, blurring the ship whenever you focus on the droplets rather than the distance. Below, dock equipment rests in pools of reflected light on the wet concrete. The vessel still appears motionless, but small signs of preparation continue around it. A service vehicle passes slowly along the quay and disappears beneath the level of the windows. Inside the terminal, the warmth remains steady. Outside, the ship waits in the rain. Soon, the window you are looking through will be replaced by one on board. You settle into a seat facing the harbour and allow the last part of the waiting to begin. The terminal feels unhurried, with only the occasional distant sound of activity somewhere behind you. Outside, the rain has become finer, leaving the quay covered in a smooth, dark sheen. The ferry's windows glow more clearly now that the evening is deepening. Beyond the ship, the sky is almost the same colour as the water, both fading into a cool blue-grey. There is something restful about having nowhere else to go for the moment. The road is behind you, the ship is in front of you, and the night has already begun to narrow around the journey. You sit quietly and watch the harbour lights strengthen. Minute by minute, the harbour becomes darker around the illuminated ship. The cranes further along the quay lose their detail and settle into black shapes against the clouded sky. Reflections from the terminal and dock lamps lengthen across puddles and narrow strips of water. The ferry now seems brighter than anything around it. Its lit windows suggest warmth, cabins and quiet interior spaces waiting beyond the steel outer walls. The rain continues without becoming heavy, just enough to soften every distant edge. From where you sit, the scene changes almost imperceptibly. Daylight is leaving the port. By the time the ship sails, the harbour will belong entirely to the night. The atmosphere in the terminal changes quietly before anything obvious happens. The far end of the waiting hall begins to open toward the boarding route, and the stillness of the last few minutes gives way to a sense of movement. You rise and make your way across the terminal without any need to rush. The ferry remains visible through the glass, now appearing even larger from this nearer angle. Along the route ahead, doors have opened toward the covered boarding passage. Warm terminal light gives way to a narrower corridor leading toward the vessel. For the first time, the distance between you and the ship begins to close quickly. The waiting part is over. The crossing is about to begin. The boarding walkway runs above part of the quay, enclosed by glass and pale metal framing. Rain taps softly against the panels while dock lights pass beside you at a slightly lower level. With every few steps, the ferry grows larger ahead until sections of its side fill the windows completely. You can see rows of dark and illuminated cabin windows high above the boarding point. Below, the wet quay reflects the white light spilling from the ship. The walkway bends gently, hiding the terminal behind you. There is now no view back toward the road or the town beyond it. Only the vessel remains ahead. You continue toward the point where the walkway meets the ship. The final section of the boarding route narrows as it bridges the small gap between terminal and ferry. Through the side windows, black harbour water lies directly below, broken by pale reflections trembling beneath the dock lights. The ship's outer wall is close enough now to see streaks of rain running down the painted metal. A faint vibration can already be felt through the floor of the gangway. It is subtle, but it makes the vessel feel alive before you have even stepped aboard. The covered passage slopes slightly toward an open doorway ahead. Warm light spills from inside the ferry. You cross the last few meters above the water, then the harbour is behind you. The sound changes the moment you enter the ship. The open, rainy harbour is replaced by the muted quiet of carpet, walls, and enclosed corridors. Warm overhead lighting stretches ahead in a long, calm line. The floor beneath you carries a low vibration that is almost easier to feel than hear. There is no need to stop and explore. Your cabin is somewhere further along, and the ferry has not yet left the quay. You follow the straightforward route through the passenger deck, passing closed doors and occasional windows without lingering. Everything has the familiar, practical order of a vessel prepared for an overnight crossing. The night outside feels much further away in here. The corridor leading toward the cabins is quieter than the boarding area behind you. Soft lighting runs along the ceiling, while the carpet absorbs most of the sound of movement. Doors repeat at regular intervals on either side, each one marking another small private space for the night. The ship's gentle mechanical hum continues beneath everything. At a junction, you turn once and continue along a slightly narrower passage. There is no sense of wandering. Each step simply carries you toward the room where the crossing will become your own. At the far end, the corridor appears almost perfectly still. Your cabin is only a short distance ahead. You stop at the correct door and open it onto a compact, warmly lit cabin. The room is simple but immediately comfortable, with the bed taking up most of one side and a small surface beneath the window. Everything is arranged for a single quiet night rather than a long stay. The light is soft enough to feel restful without making the space dim. Beyond the glass, the wet harbour remains close and bright. For a moment, you stand just inside and listen to the low vibration beneath the floor. This will be the center of the journey once the ship reaches open water. By morning, the view outside should be completely different. You move closer to the window and look back across the quay. Rain clings to the outer glass in small beads and narrow trails, catching the dock lights as they slide downward. Terminal buildings stand opposite, their illuminated windows reflecting on wet concrete below. The harbour water is visible between sections of the quay, dark and restless beneath the lights. At this distance, the everyday activity of the port feels strangely quiet. The thick glass keeps the wind and rain outside while the cabin remains warm. You can already imagine returning to this same window later in the night. Then there will be no terminal opposite, only sea. You take a few moments to settle into the cabin before departure. The small overnight bag is placed out of the way, leaving the room uncluttered and calm. The bed is neatly made, ready for the hours when the crossing becomes dark and uneventful. A soft lamp near the pillow gives the cabin a warmer glow than the main light above. The window remains uncovered so the harbour can still be watched. There is something reassuring about knowing this little room will stay with you while everything outside changes. The terminal, the open sea, and eventually the Norwegian coast will all pass beyond the same pane of glass. For now, the ferry is still tied to the quay, but not for much longer. A deeper vibration gradually rises through the cabin floor. It does not arrive suddenly, but builds until it becomes impossible not to notice. The ship feels different now, less like a building beside the harbour and more like a vessel preparing to move. Outside, the dock lights remain fixed in exactly the same places, making the new vibration feel even more pronounced. A faint tremor passes through the window frame. Somewhere below, the machinery has settled into a steady working rhythm. You sit beside the glass and listen for a moment. The sound is low, constant, and oddly comforting. Departure feels very close. The view outside remains filled with the last details of the port. Painted lines on the quay shine under the lamps while rainwater gathers along the edges of the concrete. A few pieces of dock equipment stand motionless near the ship. Further away, the terminal windows form a bright rectangle against the dark evening. Nothing dramatic announces that the ferry is ready. Instead, the harbour seems to become quieter around it. The engine vibration continues beneath your feet. You watch the nearest section of quay carefully, waiting for the first unmistakable sign that it has begun to move. At first, the change is so slight that you almost mistake it for your imagination. Then the nearest dock light begins to slide slowly across the cabin window. The quay follows it, moving backwards with a smoothness that makes the ferry itself feel perfectly still. Reflections stretch and shift across the rain-covered glass. The terminal building starts to drift away from the center of the view. There is no jolt and no sudden sense of speed. The ship simply releases itself from the harbour, one quiet metre at a time. You remain beside the window as the gap of dark water widens. The overnight journey has begun. The ferry turns gradually away from the berth and the whole harbour begins to open beyond the window. The terminal is already smaller, its bright interior reduced to a row of distant rectangles above the quay. Dock lights tremble across the black water behind you. Ahead, the harbour channel is darker, marked only by scattered navigation lights and the faint outlines of breakwaters further out. The ship continues forward at an unhurried pace. The rain is still falling, but the drops on the glass now travel differently as the vessel gathers movement. You watch the land begin its slow retreat into the evening. Beyond the harbour lies open water, a long night, and Norway somewhere ahead. The crossing is properly underway. The harbour is already beginning to fall away behind the ferry. From the window, the terminal appears smaller than it did only a few minutes ago, its bright interior reduced to a neat band of light beside the quay. Wet dock lamps tremble across the water in broken reflections, stretching and shortening as the ship moves. The rain continues to mark the glass, but the view beyond it is opening wider now. Low buildings, cranes and service roads merge gradually into one illuminated shoreline. Nothing disappears suddenly. The port simply becomes quieter and more distant with every minute. You remain beside the window and watch the place you left become part of the night behind you. The ferry's movement is easiest to judge by those lights, each one sliding a little farther away across the rain-dark glass. Ahead, the harbour channel narrows toward the outer breakwater. The ferry follows it at an easy pace, passing the last clusters of working lights along the water. Dark walls of stone and concrete extend outward on either side, their wet surfaces catching occasional flashes from nearby lamps. Beyond them, the sea is almost featureless beneath the low cloud. The vessel turns slightly as it lines up with the harbour entrance. For a few moments, the sheltered water remains smooth beside the ship. Then the final breakwater light begins to drift past the window. The protected harbour is nearly behind you. The ship's engines hold a steady note as the last sheltered markers of the port pass quietly astern. The ferry clears the harbour entrance and meets the first stretch of open water. The change is gentle but noticeable. The surface beyond the window is darker and less sheltered, with longer low swells moving beneath the ship. Behind you, the breakwater lights are already beginning to separate into smaller points. Ahead, there is no shoreline immediately visible. Only the broad, dark sea and the clouded evening sky remain. The ship continues north without any sense of hurry. For the first time, the crossing feels larger than the harbour you have just left. A deeper, slower motion reaches the cabin now, the first unmistakable sign that the ferry is no longer inside protected water. A little later, you step briefly onto a sheltered section of the outer deck. The wind is colder here than it seemed from inside, carrying fine drizzle across the covered space. Beyond the railing, the sea moves in dark blue-grey bands beneath the fading evening. The harbour is now behind and to one side, its lights much smaller than before. The ferry's white side rises close beside the deck, while the vessel continues steadily forward. You stay only long enough to feel the weather and hear the open water more clearly. There is no reason to remain outside for long. The warmth of the ship waits only a few steps away. The deck roof keeps the worst of the weather away, but cold spray still gathers along the outer railings. Back inside, the difference is immediate. The wind and fine rain are replaced by warm, still air and the muted hum of the vessel. Drops cling to the exterior glass beside you, but the weather now feels comfortably separated from the journey inside. The corridor ahead is quiet and practical, leading back toward the main passenger spaces without inviting you to wander. Through the nearest window, the sea remains visible as a dark, moving surface. The ferry feels more protective now that open water surrounds it. Outside is cold, wet, and increasingly dark. Inside, everything continues at the same calm pace. The warmth feels more noticeable after only a few minutes in the open air, and the windows now seem like a clear boundary between comfort and weather. You settle beside a large window where the evening can pass without interruption. The seat faces the water, leaving little between you and the changing horizon except the rain-marked glass. The coast is still faintly visible in places, low and dark beneath the heavy sky. Harbour lights have almost vanished behind you. The sea now fills most of the view, reflecting very little beyond the last traces of daylight. Inside, the lighting remains soft and restrained. You watch without needing anything else to happen. The journey is simply carrying you farther from land. Every few moments, a small patch of lighter water passes beneath the window and disappears into the growing dusk. The last clear shape of the coastline begins to fade. At first, it is still possible to follow a low, dark line across part of the horizon. Then mist and distance break it into separate patches. A few lights remain visible for a while longer, each one dimmer than the last. The rain softens the boundary between sea and sky until both seem to belong to the same blue-grey evening. You keep watching as one final stretch of land slips into the haze. Soon, there is no obvious edge to follow. The ferry continues north into open water. The disappearance of the shore is so gradual that there is no single moment when you can say it has finally gone. With the coast gone, the view becomes simpler. Grey sea stretches outward beneath a darkening sky, crossed by low rolling swells and occasional streaks of reflected light from the ship. The horizon is still visible, but only as a subtle change in tone. Rain gathers in small trails across the glass and moves slowly downward. There are no buildings, roads, or shore lights to measure distance now, only water moving past the vessel. The absence of landmarks makes the crossing feel quieter rather than empty. The ship holds its steady course through the evening. The steady lack of scenery has its own calm, giving the eye nothing to follow except the slow movement of water. Later, you sit down for a simple evening meal beside one of the broad windows. The dining area is warm and understated, with the dark sea remaining visible beyond the glass. There is nothing elaborate about the moment. A plate, a drink, soft light, and the low vibration of the ferry are enough. Outside, the last remaining colour in the sky has almost drained away. Rain occasionally catches the window and turns distant light into a soft blur. The meal passes slowly while the ship continues north. Even here, the sense of travel never leaves the view. The ferry's motion is just noticeable beneath the table, gentle enough to become part of the evening rather than interrupt it. As the evening deepens, the glass begins to hold more of the interior light. Warm reflections from the dining area hover faintly across the dark window, layered over the sea beyond. When you look past them, the water is still there, moving steadily under the ship. The reflections shift whenever the ferry rolls gently with the swell. Outside remains cool and almost colorless. Inside, the warm light is soft enough not to overwhelm the darkness beyond. For a while, both spaces seem to share the same pane of glass. The journey continues between them. Now and then, a brighter ceiling light appears in the glass and slides across the reflection as your viewpoint changes slightly. Far along the horizon, a narrow band of pale evening light still remains. It is the final trace of dusk stretched thin beneath the cloud. Everything above it has already deepened toward navy and charcoal. Everything below it is dark water. The ferry moves through the middle of that fading light without changing pace. Minute by minute, the band becomes weaker. Soon it is no longer bright enough to separate sea from sky. Night is almost complete. The remaining light feels less like sunset now and more like a memory of the day being left behind. A small group of lights appears far out across the water. At first, they seem fixed, but after watching for a while, you notice them shifting slowly against the dark horizon. Another vessel is crossing the distance. Its shape is too far away to make out, leaving only a few white and amber points suspended over the sea. For several minutes, the lights remain visible through the rain. Then the angle changes and they begin to slip away toward the edge of the window. The two ships continue on separate courses through the same darkening water. Its distant presence briefly gives scale to the open water, making the darkness around both vessels seem even wider. Rain returns more steadily against the windows. Fine droplets gather quickly, joining into longer trails that distort the sea beyond. Dock lights are gone now, and there is almost nothing outside for the rain to catch except the faintest glow from the ship itself. The weather sounds softer from inside than it looked from the deck. You can hear it tapping against the glass beneath the deeper mechanical hum. The sea remains calm enough for the motion to feel gentle. Outside, the night thickens around the ferry. Inside, the crossing stays warm and unhurried. Water gathers along the lower edge of the window before being pulled away again by the ship's steady movement through the weather. By now, there is no coast left in any direction. The ferry is fully committed to the night crossing. Through the window, the horizon appears only occasionally when the cloud and water separate into different shades of darkness. There are no buildings or roads behind you anymore. No harbour entrance ahead, only the open sea carrying the ship farther north. The absence of land makes the cabin lights and warm interior spaces feel more reassuring. The journey has entered its longest uninterrupted stretch. The darkness outside is broad and uninterrupted, but the ferry feels stable and purposeful within it. After some time, the movement of the ferry begins to feel familiar. The slight rise and fall beneath the floor no longer asks for attention. It settles into the same background as the engine hum and the soft contact of rain against glass. You notice the rhythm only when you think about it. Otherwise, the ship seems almost still around you. Outside, dark water continues to pass without landmarks. Inside, the evening has become quieter. The crossing has found its steady pace. The repetition is soothing. Engine, rain, slight motion, then the same sequence beginning again without effort. The last blue of evening deepens toward full night. For a short while, the sea still carries a faint blue-grey tone beneath the clouds. Then even that begins to disappear. The window becomes darker, holding more reflections from the softly lit interior. Occasional pale crests on the water appear and vanish beside the ship. The transition is gradual enough that you barely notice the exact moment dusk ends. 1 minute, there is still colour outside. The next, the ferry is travelling beneath a fully dark sky. The change leaves the interior feeling warmer by contrast, even though nothing inside the ferry has altered at all. From a rear-facing window, you catch sight of the ferry's wake stretching into the darkness. Pale foam draws a long, uneven path across the black water behind the ship. Closer to the vessel, it is bright and restless. Farther back, it softens into grey and finally disappears. No harbour lights remain at the end of it now, only the route already travelled. You watch for a few quiet moments as the wake continues to rebuild itself behind the ferry. Then the darkness closes over it again. The sight confirms what the windows ahead no longer can. The ferry is making steady progress through the night. The evening is beginning to wind down and you return toward your cabin. The route back is simple and familiar now. Warm corridor lighting, muted carpet and closed doors lead you directly toward the small room that will carry you through the night. There is no need to stop anywhere along the way. Through an occasional exterior window, only darkness and rain remain. The public areas of the ferry already feel quieter than they did earlier. By the time you reach the cabin corridor, the journey has taken on a more private rhythm. The cabin feels less like a room you found earlier and more like the place you naturally return to as the crossing settles down. Back inside the cabin, you leave the curtain open and look outside once more. The window that showed the bright terminal earlier now holds almost nothing but darkness. A few faint reflections from the cabin lamp sit on the glass. Beyond them, black water moves past under a clouded sky. Rain continues in narrow trails across the pane. The difference from the harbour view is complete. Land has gone, the ship is well underway, and the night crossing now surrounds you on every side. You stay by the window for another moment before settling in. The steady engine hum now seems to belong to the cabin itself, present beneath every other small sound. Night has fully taken the sea. Outside the cabin window, the horizon has almost disappeared and the water is reduced to dark movement beneath the glass. The ferry continues north with the same low engine note and gentle motion that has followed you since departure. There is nothing ahead that needs to be seen tonight. Norway remains somewhere beyond the darkness, still many hours away. For now, the ship has only one task: to keep moving quietly through the night while you begin to rest. The crossing has entered its sleeping hours. The darkness outside no longer feels like something to watch closely. It has become the background to sleep. The cabin feels quieter once the brighter light is switched off. Only the small bedside lamp remains, casting a low amber glow across the bed and the edge of the desk. Beyond the window, the sea has almost disappeared into darkness. Rain continues to gather on the glass, catching the faintest traces of light before sliding away. The engine hum is deeper here than it seemed in the public areas, softened by the walls but always present beneath the silence. You begin to notice how little there is left to do. The ferry is well into the crossing now. The harbour is far behind, Norway is still ahead, and the cabin has become a small, warm place moving quietly between them. The lower light changes the room immediately, making the outside darkness feel even farther away. With the cabin dimmed, the rain becomes easier to hear. It taps gently against the thick window in irregular patterns, sometimes gathering into a steadier run before easing again. Outside, there is almost nothing for the eye to follow. The sea appears only when a pale crest catches enough light to separate itself from the black water around it. Most of the time, the glass holds darkness, droplets and a few faint reflections from the lamp beside the bed. The weather feels distant from inside the cabin. There is no urgency in it and no sense of storm, just rain travelling with the ferry through the night, soft enough to become part of the rhythm of the crossing. Beneath the rain, the engine hum continues with the same steady note. It is not loud. Instead, it seems to exist within the floor and walls, a low vibration that you feel almost as much as you hear. Earlier, the sound marked the moment the ship prepared to leave the harbour. Now, it has become something familiar. The ferry is moving exactly as it should, carrying you north while the cabin remains warm and still around you. Every so often, a slightly deeper vibration passes through the room and then settles again. Nothing changes outside. The darkness remains complete and the machinery below continues its patient work through the night. You look through the window again and find only black water beyond the rain. The horizon is difficult to separate from the clouded sky. Close to the ship, occasional streaks of pale foam appear for a moment before slipping backwards into darkness. They are the only clear evidence of movement outside. The rest of the sea seems almost still when seen from this warm, enclosed room. Rain trails continue down the glass, sometimes bending slightly as the wind meets the side of the ferry. You watch for a little while without trying to make out anything more. There is nothing out there that needs to be seen tonight, only open water and the long crossing continuing north. The cabin is ready for sleep now. The desk has been left clear, the small overnight bag remains tucked out of the way, and the bed waits beneath the warm bedside light. You make the room a little darker, leaving only enough light to move comfortably. The curtain stays open. There is something reassuring about keeping the night sea beside you, even when almost nothing can be seen beyond the glass. The gentle vibration beneath the floor remains unchanged. Rain continues softly outside. Everything about the cabin suggests that the active part of the evening is over. From here, the ferry can do the travelling for you while the hours pass unnoticed. From the bed, the window sits almost directly within your line of sight. Its rounded frame is darker now, and the glass beyond it holds little more than rain and the faintest suggestion of moving sea. The room feels different from this lower, more settled viewpoint. The ceiling light is off, the bedside lamp is soft, and the sound of the engines seems more distant than before. You lie still for a while and listen. There is the low, mechanical hum beneath everything. There is the quiet contact of water against the hull. And there is the rain, sometimes distinct and sometimes almost lost among the other sounds. Nothing asks for your attention. The journey continues whether you watch it or not. The ship rises and settles gently beneath you. The movement is slow enough that it does not disturb the stillness of the cabin. Instead, it becomes another repeating part of the night, a slight lift, a soft settling, then a few quiet seconds before the same motion returns. The open sea outside is darker than the room, but its movement can still be sensed through the ferry. You no longer need to judge the crossing by lights, coastlines, or the changing view. The rhythm beneath the bed is enough. It is steady, predictable, and calm. Before long, you begin noticing the motion only when it briefly fades, rather than when it returns. Your attention starts to loosen from the sounds around you. The rain against the window no longer arrives as separate taps. The engine hum becomes a continuous low background. Even the gentle movement of the ship begins to blend into the mattress beneath you. The cabin remains warm and dim, with the open curtain framing a square of darkness beside the bed. There is no reason to stay awake for anything ahead. The Norwegian coast will not appear for many hours yet. For now, the ferry has settled into the middle of the crossing, surrounded by open water and night. Your thoughts begin to drift more slowly. The sounds of the ship remain, but they no longer require listening. While the cabin grows quieter around you, the ferry continues north. Nothing about the room reveals how much distance is passing outside. The lamp stays still, the curtain barely moves, the desk and bed remain exactly where they were when the harbour first disappeared. Only the faint shifting darkness beyond the window suggests that the ship is travelling at all. Somewhere below, the engines maintain the same patient rhythm. Beyond the hull, the sea continues sliding past unseen. There is comfort in knowing that the journey does not need your attention. The vessel holds its course through the night while you simply rest inside it. Sleep arrives without a clear beginning. One moment you are still aware of rain at the window and the soft vibration beneath the bed. Then the sounds begin to feel farther away. The bedside lamp has been lowered until only a faint warm glow remains across the cabin. Outside, the sea is completely dark. No light marks the horizon and no distant vessel crosses the window. The ferry moves on through the unseen water. Your breathing slows with the quiet rhythm of the room. The journey continues somewhere beyond awareness, carrying you north while the cabin slips gently out of focus. Before long, the night belongs more to sleep than to travel. At some point later, you wake briefly. For a few seconds, the cabin is unfamiliar in the darkness. Then the low engine hum returns to awareness, followed by the gentle movement beneath the bed. Nothing has changed. The ferry is still traveling north. Rain remains on the window, though the sound of it seems softer than before. The room is almost completely dark now, with only the faintest warm glow near the bedside. You do not need to check the time. There is no schedule that matters from here. The crossing is still in its sleeping hours, and the darkness outside gives no clue how much of the night has passed. The window at this hour shows almost nothing. Black sea lies beneath a blacker sky, separated only occasionally by a subtle change in tone. A few pale traces of foam appear close to the vessel and vanish again before your eyes can settle on them. The rain on the glass catches one tiny reflection from inside the cabin. Beyond that, there is no light, no coastline, no harbour, no other ship. The ferry is somewhere in the long middle of the crossing, surrounded by open water. For a moment, you simply watch the darkness move. Then even that becomes difficult to distinguish, and the window returns to being a quiet black shape beside the bed. As you listen, you realize the rain has begun to ease. The steady tapping from earlier has thinned into occasional droplets against the glass. Some of the older trails remain on the window, but fewer new ones are joining them. The sea outside is still hidden by darkness. The ship's motion remains gentle and unchanged. Without the constant rain, the engine hum becomes more noticeable for a while, low and steady beneath the room. The change is small enough that it might have happened gradually while you slept. Nothing else has shifted. The ferry continues north through the same deep night, carrying you toward a morning that still feels far away. You settle back beneath the covers and let the cabin become quiet again. The brief waking has passed without needing anything from you. There is no reason to get up and no view outside worth waiting for yet. The sea remains dark. The rain has softened. The engine continues with the same patient vibration beneath the floor. You close your eyes and allow the sounds to move into the background once more. The ship's gentle rise and fall returns to the edge of awareness. A few minutes later, even that begins to disappear. The crossing continues, but you no longer feel the need to follow it. Sleep comes back easily. This feels like the quietest part of the journey. The corridors beyond the cabin seem completely still. No footsteps pass the door. No voices carry through the walls. Even the weather has become subdued. Inside the room, the only constant sound is the low machinery far below and the faint movement of water against the ship. Outside the window, the darkness remains uninterrupted. The ferry seems almost suspended within the night, even though it is still making steady progress north. The cabin is warm, the bed is still, and the hours continue passing without announcement. Nothing changes quickly enough to disturb the calm. Several hours pass without being noticed. The ferry covers mile after mile while the cabin remains unchanged. There are no landmarks to mark the distance and no station stops to interrupt the night. The journey is continuous. Outside, the open sea remains hidden beneath darkness and low cloud. Inside, the same quiet engine note carries through the walls. Sleep turns the crossing into something almost effortless. You do not have to watch the route or measure the time. The ship continues doing what it has done since leaving the harbour, moving steadily north, carrying the sleeping cabin with it toward the coast that will eventually appear beyond the window. Later, you surface from sleep again for only a moment. The first thing you notice is how calm the cabin feels. The ferry is still moving, but the gentle rise and fall seems slightly softer than before. Rain no longer taps constantly at the window. Instead, only an occasional drop reaches the glass. The darkness beyond remains deep, though the sea sounds quieter against the hull. You stay still and listen long enough to recognize the familiar engine hum. Everything is exactly where it should be. There is no reason to wake fully. Within moments, the cabin begins slipping back towards sleep around you. The next time your eyes open, the window looks very slightly different. At first, you cannot tell why. The sea is still dark and the sky is still clouded, but the glass no longer seems completely black. A faint blue-grey tone sits somewhere beyond the rain marks, subtle enough that it could almost be imagined. The bedside lamp is off now, leaving the room to whatever weak light reaches it from outside. Nothing on the horizon can be made out. There is no land yet. Still, the darkness feels thinner than it did before. The night has not ended, but somewhere beyond the window, morning has begun moving closer. You let your eyes close again, rather than waiting for the light to change. There is still plenty of darkness left outside, and the ferry has more distance to cover before the Norwegian coast appears. The cabin remains quiet around you. The engine hum is unchanged. The sea continues moving beyond the glass, now only faintly lighter than before. You settle back into the bed and allow the final dark part of the crossing to pass without watching it. The ship keeps its steady course. Somewhere ahead, islands and shoreline are waiting beyond the night. For now, they remain unseen while you drift back into sleep. By the end of the sleeping hours, the darkness outside has begun to loosen. It is not yet dawn. The sea is still mostly black, and the clouded sky holds only the faintest suggestion of blue-grey. But the window is no longer a featureless square beside the bed. The outline of the water can just begin to separate from the sky when you look carefully. Rain has eased to scattered droplets on the glass. The ferry continues north with the same low vibration that has carried through the entire night. Nothing has arrived yet. Still, the first quiet change is underway. Morning is beginning somewhere beyond the horizon. The next time you become aware of the cabin, the darkness has changed again. The room is still mostly shadow, but a faint blue-grey light now reaches further from the window than it did before. The bedside lamp remains off. Beyond the glass, the sea has separated clearly from the clouded sky for the first time since the middle of the night. Both are dark, but they are no longer the same darkness. Scattered droplets remain on the window, almost motionless now that the heavier rain has passed. The ferry continues with the same gentle vibration beneath the bed. Morning has not arrived yet, but the night is beginning to release the crossing. A little later, the horizon holds a thin grey line beneath the clouds. It is not sunrise. There is no colour in it and no bright edge of light. The change is simply enough to give shape to the open water again. Low swells move steadily beneath the ferry, darker than the sky above them. The rain has almost stopped completely. Only older trails remain on parts of the glass. You watch the faint line without expecting anything to appear along it yet. For now, there is still only sea ahead. But morning is gathering quietly beyond the cloud. Gradually, you realize that sleep has finished for the night. The cabin is still quiet, but it no longer feels like the middle of darkness. The bed, desk, and curtains can all be made out now without switching on a light. Cool morning grey has begun replacing the warm tones that filled the room before you slept. Outside, the sea continues beneath low cloud. The ferry's movement feels gentler than it did during the first hours offshore. You remain where you are for another few minutes, listening to the familiar engine hum. Somewhere ahead, the Norwegian coast is drawing closer. For the first time since departure, there is something beyond the darkness to wait for. At first, the shape on the horizon could easily be mistaken for a darker bank of cloud. You watch it for a while before the outline begins to hold its place. It does not move or change with the sky. A low, broken ridge stretches across one part of the distance. Then another darker shape appears beside it. The Norwegian coast has finally come into view. It is still far away, softened by mist and weak morning light. There are no clear buildings or roads yet. Only land where there had been nothing but sea for hours. After the long night crossing, even that faint outline feels like a quiet arrival. The outline strengthens as the ferry continues forward. What seemed like one dark ridge begins dividing into separate layers. Lower islands sit in front of higher land. Further inland, rocky edges become visible where the grey water meets the shore. Patches of dark trees cover some of the slopes, while other sections remain bare beneath the cloud. The colours are still subdued: slate water, charcoal rock, muted evergreen, and a pale morning sky. Nothing appears suddenly. Norway simply gathers more detail with every mile. The open sea crossing is beginning to become a coastal approach. The ferry reaches the first scattered islands of the Norwegian coast. They sit low in the water, their rock darkened by the damp morning. Some a little more than bare rounded shapes rising from the sea. Others carry patches of fur and scrub along their higher ground. The water between them looks smoother than the open sea behind. The ship follows a broad route through the outer coastal waters without noticeably slowing. Each island passes gradually along the window and falls behind. Beyond them, more land appears through the haze. The journey is no longer across empty water. You are travelling through the first edge of Norway. The weather continues changing as the coast comes closer. Rain that followed the ferry through most of the night has almost disappeared. Only an occasional small drop reaches the window now. Beyond the glass, patches of mist hang between the islands and the higher ground beyond them. The cloud remains low, but the morning beneath it is noticeably brighter. Rock faces show more texture. Trees separate into individual dark shapes. The water carries softer reflections of the grey sky. For the first time since leaving the harbour the previous evening, the weather feels as though it is opening rather than closing around the journey. You sit up properly for the first time since the night began. The cabin looks different in natural morning light. Warm wood that seemed almost amber beneath the bedside lamp now appears softer and more neutral. The bed remains rumpled from sleep, while the desk beneath the window is still exactly as you left it. Outside, islands continue passing slowly across the glass. The ferry's overnight cabin has carried you from a rainy harbour through complete darkness and into a different coastline. There is no need to hurry. Arrival is getting closer, but the ship still has distance to cover. For now, the changing view is enough. One of the outer islands passes much closer than the others. From the window, its shoreline moves slowly across your field of view. Dark rock slopes directly into the water, wet and almost black along the lowest edge. Higher up, small evergreens cling to uneven ground. There is no dramatic cliff and no towering mountain. The landscape is lower and quieter than that. A narrow channel of grey water separates the ferry from the shore. For several minutes, the island remains beside you. Then it begins slipping backwards, revealing another stretch of sheltered water ahead. The Norwegian coast is no longer something on the horizon. It is now surrounding the journey. The character of the journey changes again beyond the outer islands. The water becomes noticeably calmer. Long offshore swells are replaced by smaller movements running between sheltered stretches of land. The ferry still feels steady beneath you, but the sea outside now looks almost contained. Islands overlap one another along the horizon, creating layers of dark rock, trees and mist. Occasional gaps open between them to reveal wider water beyond. The ship follows the established channel deeper toward the coast. There is still no sense of arriving immediately. Instead, Norway seems to unfold gradually around the ferry. The long, open water part of the crossing is now behind you. Back inside the cabin, the sleeping part of the journey begins to disappear. The bed is left behind in its morning state, while the small overnight bag is brought back out from where it rested during the night. The desk remains clear. The curtain stays open so the passing coast can still be seen while you get ready. Natural grey daylight now fills enough of the room that no lamp is needed. Outside, another wooded island moves gradually beyond the window. The ferry is still travelling, but the cabin already feels temporary again. Soon there will be no reason to return to it. For now, everything is simply gathered and made ready for arrival. The cabin corridor feels different in daylight. It is the same narrow passage you followed the previous night, but the atmosphere has shifted completely. Warm ceiling lights remain on, though they are less noticeable against the weak natural light reaching occasional windows. Closed cabin doors repeat along the walls as before. The ferry's engine hum is still present beneath the carpeted quiet. You follow the familiar route toward the passenger areas without stopping. Through one small exterior window, pale water and dark shoreline pass beyond the glass. The night journey is ending, but the ship is still carrying you through its final miles. You return to a window-side table for a simple breakfast while the ferry continues toward the coast. The room is brighter than it was during dinner. Natural grey morning light reaches across the tables, reducing the warm interior reflections that filled the glass the previous evening. A simple breakfast sits in front of you while islands drift past outside. The water between them is calm enough to carry faint reflections of the cloud. There is still no rush. The ferry is moving steadily toward its destination, and the shoreline grows more settled with every mile. After a night spent traveling through darkness, eating beside the morning coast feels like part of the arrival itself. The first unmistakable houses appear along the shoreline. They are scattered rather than gathered into a town, separated by stretches of rock, trees, and damp grass. Some sit close to the water, others stand slightly higher on the slopes behind them. From the ferry, they remain small, their pale walls and darker roofs briefly visible between trees. A narrow road appears along one section of the coast and disappears again behind rising ground. These are the first ordinary signs of life you have seen since leaving the port the night before. The landscape no longer feels remote. The ferry is approaching inhabited water now. Outside again, the morning feels completely different from the previous evening. The wind is cool, but no longer carries steady rain. The covered deck remains wet from the night, with small beads of water still resting along the rail. Beyond it, the Norwegian shoreline passes beneath low cloud. Rocky islands, dark trees, and scattered houses move slowly across the view. The sea is calmer here, protected by the land around it. The ferry's wake spreads pale behind the vessel before flattening across the grey water. You remain under the shelter of the deck roof and watch the coast pass. Norway is no longer ahead. You are already travelling within it. The route begins to feel more enclosed as larger stretches of land draw closer. The ferry follows a broad channel between wooded shores. There is still plenty of room around the vessel, but open sea is no longer visible in any direction. Rocky slopes rise gradually from the water before disappearing into trees and low cloud. Small houses become more frequent. Occasional jetties extend a short distance from the shoreline. The ferry maintains an unhurried pace through the sheltered water. Its movement now seems easier to judge against the nearby land. Every bend in the channel brings another part of the coast into view. The destination cannot be far away. Beyond one final stretch of wooded coast, the character of the shoreline changes. Larger buildings begin appearing near the water. A few cranes and harbour structures rise above them through the grey morning. The shapes are still distant, but they are unmistakably part of the port ahead. After hours of darkness, open water and scattered islands, the sight feels almost surprising. The ferry continues along the channel toward them. Small navigation structures pass slowly at the edges of the water. Behind the harbour, low hills remain dark beneath the cloud. The overnight journey is entering its final approach. You follow the familiar corridor back toward the cabin one final time. The route now feels shorter than it did the previous evening. The same doors pass on either side. The same quiet carpet softens your steps, but the journey attached to them has changed completely. When you first walked this way, the ferry was still beside the rainy departure harbour. Now Norway lies beyond the windows. The cabin door waits ahead exactly where it did before. There is nothing left to settle into this time. You are only returning to collect the small bag and take one final look outside. The cabin is brighter now than at any point during the crossing. Cool morning light reaches across the bed, desk and wall without the help of the bedside lamp. The small bag is ready near the door. Through the window, sheltered Norwegian water slides past beneath the ferry. A wooded shoreline lies beyond it, close enough now to make out individual houses and small structures along the coast. It is difficult to connect this view with the black window you watched during the deepest part of the night. The room itself has not changed, only everything beyond the glass has. You stand there for another moment before leaving the cabin behind. From the passenger windows, the arrival harbour now fills much more of the view. The ferry has slowed enough that the shoreline seems to move differently beside the ship. Harbour buildings stand clearly ahead, backed by low wooded hills beneath the morning cloud. Quays extend into the water. Working lights remain visible even though daylight has arrived. The water around the vessel is calmer than at any point since departure. Behind you lie the outer islands and the long night crossing. Ahead is the berth where the journey by sea will end. The ferry continues forward at a slow, measured pace. Norway is no longer a distant shape beyond the window. You have arrived at its harbour. The harbour shifts slowly across the passenger window as the ferry begins its final turn. Buildings that had been directly ahead move gradually toward one side of the view. A long section of quay comes into clearer sight beyond the calm water. The ship is moving much more slowly now. Its earlier forward rhythm has been replaced by something careful and deliberate. Across the harbour, working lights remain faintly visible beneath the grey morning. Low wooded hills rise behind the waterfront. Nothing about the manoeuvre feels hurried. After travelling through the entire night, the ferry is taking its final few minutes to reach the place where the crossing will end. The quay begins to fill more of the window. Its concrete edge is still separated from the ferry by a broad strip of dark water, but the distance is closing steadily. Lamps, barriers, and dock equipment can now be made out individually. Rain from earlier has left the ground wet beneath the morning cloud. Small puddles hold pale reflections of the harbour lights. The ferry moves almost sideways for a moment as it settles into position. From inside, the movement is smooth enough to be difficult to judge. Only the changing distance to the quay reveals how carefully the vessel is approaching. The ferry slides slowly beside the harbour wall. From this distance, the rough surface of the quay is clearly visible. Dark marks run along the edge where countless vessels have rested before. Beyond it stand low terminal buildings and practical service areas, still quiet beneath the overcast morning. The landscape behind them feels unexpectedly close after so many hours of empty water. Trees cover the hills beyond the port. A few houses sit higher on the slopes. The ship continues easing forward by only a small amount at a time. The crossing has become a matter of meters now rather than miles. A deeper vibration briefly passes through the ship. It feels different from the steady engine rhythm that carried you through the night. The sound rises for a few seconds and then falls away again. Outside, the quay appears almost stationary. The ferry makes one final adjustment, shifting gently until the berth sits almost perfectly alongside the windows. Water moves in slow circles between the hull and the concrete edge. Then the movement becomes smaller again. The long journey north is ending without ceremony. There is no sudden stop, only a series of quiet emotions, each one shorter than the last. For the first time since leaving the departure harbour, the ferry becomes completely still. The low vibration remains beneath the floor, but the movement through the water has ended. Outside, the same section of quay stays fixed beside the window. Puddles no longer drift backwards. Harbour lamps no longer slide across the glass. The change is simple but unmistakable. You have reached Norway. Beyond the terminal buildings, wooded hills rise beneath the cloud, exactly where they were a moment ago. The overnight crossing has finished moving. For a little while, you remain where you are and let the stillness settle around the ship. The harbour looks different now that the ferry is no longer moving through it. Small details begin to stand out. Rainwater rests along the concrete. A narrow jetty extends from one side of the terminal area. Service equipment remains parked beyond the berth. Further inland, the dark trees climbing the hillside are completely still in the damp morning. The cabin, sea, and coastline have been moving past you for so many hours that this fixed view feels almost unusual. You wait beside the window while the ship completes whatever preparations are needed below. There is nothing for you to do yet. Arrival has happened, but disembarkation has not quite begun. Inside the ferry, the atmosphere changes much as it did before boarding the previous evening. The journey itself is over, but movement ashore has not begun. You remain near the windows for another few quiet minutes. Morning light fills the passenger area now, reducing the warm interior lighting to a softer background glow. Outside, the quay remains fixed beside the vessel. There is something satisfying about seeing solid ground so close after the long stretch of night sea. Your small bag is ready. Nothing remains in the cabin that needs your attention. From here, there is only one part of the journey left, leaving the ship. The route toward the exit becomes clear, and you begin following it through the ship. There is no rush. The familiar passenger spaces pass quietly behind you as the corridor narrows toward the disembarkation area. Morning light appears through occasional windows. Norwegian shoreline now sits motionless beyond them. The ferry feels different when it is tied to land. Its corridors no longer seem to be carrying you anywhere. They have become simply the final path toward the door. You continue forward with a small bag and leave the windows behind. Ahead, brighter light marks the way toward the gangway. The corridor ahead is shorter and more functional than the cabin passage. Its walls are plain, its lighting bright and practical. Beyond a set of open doors, the covered gangway is visible. For the first time since boarding the previous evening, you can see a direct route from the ship back onto land. The air near the doorway feels slightly cooler. The steady machinery of the ferry remains behind you while the quiet terminal waits ahead. You move toward the opening without stopping. There is no need to look back yet. The journey is carrying you forward for the final time. You cross the threshold and leave the ferry behind. The change beneath your feet is subtle. One moment, the low vibration of the vessel is still present. The next, the gangway feels completely fixed beneath you. Through its glass sides, the wet quay lies below. The ferry's white outer wall rises close beside the walkway, motionless now against the berth. Beyond the terminal glass, grey morning waits over the harbour. After the long night of movement, the stillness of the gangway feels almost strange. You continue toward the terminal. For the first time since yesterday evening, you are no longer aboard the ship. The gangway stretches above the wet harbour surface for a short distance. Below, puddles lie across the concrete exactly where they gathered during the night's rain. The ferry is now behind and slightly to one side. Ahead, the terminal grows larger with every step. Through the glass, the harbour can still be seen beyond the buildings. Low cloud rests over the wooded hills. The weather has remained grey, but the morning feels brighter than it did when Norway first appeared on the horizon. The journey from ship to land lasts only a few minutes. Even so, it feels like the final crossing within the crossing. The gangway ends inside the terminal. Warm, dry air replaces the damp harbour atmosphere visible through the glass. The building is simple and functional. A wide corridor leads directly away from the ship toward the exit. Natural morning light reaches through windows along one side. There is no reason to stop. The ferry remains visible briefly through the glass behind you before the angle of the corridor removes it from view. After so many hours spent inside the vessel, the still floor beneath you feels noticeably different. You follow the straightforward route toward the outside world. Norway is now only a few doors away. The corridor opens into a wider hall near the terminal exit. Morning light fills the space more evenly here. Broad windows look toward the harbour forecourt and the hills beyond it. The floor carries faint traces of damp from the weather outside. Everything is quiet and ordinary. There is none of the anticipation that filled the departure terminal the night before. This building exists at the other end of that feeling. The waiting is finished. The sea has already been crossed. You continue directly toward the glass doors ahead. Beyond them lies the first morning of the journey on Norwegian land. Before reaching the doors, you see the morning clearly for the first time without a ship window framing it. The terminal forecourt is wet from the night's rain. Beyond it, harbour buildings sit beneath the same low cloud that followed the ferry toward the coast. Trees cover the hills behind them in dark layers. The air outside looks cool and freshly washed. Nothing about the scene is dramatic. It is simply different from the place where the journey began. Yesterday evening, there was a rainy road leading toward a ferry. This morning, there is a Norwegian harbour waiting beyond the glass. You step through the doors and into the cool Norwegian morning. The air feels sharper than it did inside the terminal. There is still moisture on the ground, but the rain itself has stopped. The harbour lies only a short distance away. Behind the terminal buildings, wooded hills rise beneath the low cloud. Small sounds carry more clearly outside. Water against the quay, a distant engine somewhere within the harbour. The faint movement of wind through damp trees. After the enclosed warmth of the ferry, the morning feels open and still. For the first time, the entire night crossing is behind you. You follow the sheltered edge of the terminal into the forecourt. The harbour opens more clearly from here. The water is almost completely calm between the quays. Across it, low buildings sit at the foot of the wooded hillside. A few lamps remain on despite the strengthening morning. The ferry itself is hidden temporarily behind part of the terminal. The ground beneath you is solid and unmoving. After hours of gentle rise and fall, that stillness remains noticeable. There is no need to go anywhere quickly. The journey has already delivered you where it promised. Everything beyond this point belongs to the day ahead. Turning slightly, you see the ferry again beyond the terminal building. It looks different from here. During the evening, it seemed enormous when first seen across the departure harbour. Through the night, it became a small, enclosed world of corridors, windows, and one quiet cabin. Now, it is simply a ship resting beside a Norwegian quay. Its windows no longer carry the mystery they did before boarding. You know what lies behind them: the warm cabin, the dark sea, the rain, the long sleeping hours. All of it now belongs to the journey that has just finished. The terminal begins to fall behind as you follow the simple route away from the harbour. Wet pavement continues beneath the low grey sky. The building becomes smaller behind you with each step. Through a gap beside it, part of the ferry remains visible at the berth. Ahead, the harbour road curves gently between low buildings and trees. There is no need to decide anything about the day yet. For now, it is enough to know that the overnight journey has ended exactly where it was meant to. The rain, the ship, and the dark open water have all become part of the route behind you. Morning lies ahead. From a little further away, the harbour settles into one complete view. Grey water rests between the quays. The ferry sits alongside the terminal, smaller now against the wooded hillside behind it. Cloud still covers the sky, but the morning has brightened enough to reveal the colours of the coast more clearly. Dark green trees, pale buildings, wet stone, slate water. Nothing resembles the black sea that filled the cabin window during the night. You stop only briefly. The crossing no longer feels like something still happening. It has become a journey completed from one shore to another. You leave the harbour behind and continue into the morning. The road ahead is still damp beneath the cloud. Trees rise beyond the low buildings, their dark branches holding the last traces of the night's rain. Somewhere behind you, the ferry remains at the quay. Its engines carried you away from a rainy evening, across open water, through hours of sleep, and into the first grey light of another country. There is no need to look back again. The journey has done what journeys are meant to do. The place where you began has disappeared behind the night, and ahead, beneath the quiet Norwegian sky, a new morning has already begun.